on Friday. And here they're doing the pumpkin regatta, but I looked up after lecture who won this year, and it was actually a guy from Minnesota that won, which is he's a horticulture teacher, Anoka, Minnesota. So in the Midwest, with a relatively short growing season compared to if you grow pumpkins in California, let's say. And so the fact that he won, that's saying something because much shorter growing season. We also have much more fluctuations in temperature in the spring compared to California, where a lot of the pumpkin growers are. So 2,560 pounds. Look at how big that is. That's before he trucked it out of his backyard. And then here he is at the contest in California where he won. 2,560 pounds. Yes, he drove it. Can you imagine how? Huh? I'd be sweating buckets if I was him because if it breaks, it's like, oh my gosh. So he probably had to rent a very particular truck with good suspension and the whole deal. So good for him. I think he won, what did it say? $22,000. That's not bad. And then he can sell, if there's seeds in there, he can sell them for a good price. So he might make more than the 23,000. Yeah, right. So the last slide is some of the, you can read it, it's posted. I posted this slide set in EduCat, but just wanted to share that with you. Midwest. All right, another thing that I'll post, I don't know if I did it yet, but we were covering hormones and we were talking about how you can find like cytokinins in, essentially they're saying it can help regenerate your skin cells and reduce wrinkles because it's regenerating your skin cells. So I posted, or I will post this. This is just looking at some of the published studies that have been done, and it's actually like turning out to be true. So it's a plant hormone that can delay senescence in plants, and now they're finding it has a similar impact on human skin cells. So they're looking at that. So I guess those products, I used to kind of poo-poo them and say, oh, that's just a gimmick, but maybe not. Maybe there is something to that. This is another one. Confers protection against oxidative stress. That's good. Good thing. Delays onset of aging in human fibroblasts. So anti-kind achieved without any increase in the cell culture lifespan. Blah, blah, blah. Here's another. Here's one. It's auxin. They call it auxin, which is a plant hormone. So I thought that was interesting. Right. I mean, you can order plant hormones. So if you want to make your own, do it yourself. Cream. Kynotin in disease therapy and healthy aging. I thought that was interesting. It protects against stress. Clinical candidate for neurodegenerative disease, familial dysautonomia. I'm not quite sure what that means, but they're looking at it for its use in certain diseases. This is just a schematic looking at how they might be using kynotin to help, whether it be for slowing down aging. They're looking at, in the mouse, they're doing studies in mice and rats, in isolated human cells, and with clinical trials. So they're actually getting into it. Here's another paper. This one was in 2020, so pretty recent. Natural and synthetic cytokinins and their applications in biotechnology, agrochemistry, and medicine. So it's becoming a thing. This is a whole review paper just about how they're starting to use cytokinins. Jasminates, we're going to talk about jasminates pretty quickly here. That's another hormone, a new active substance in pharmaceutical and cosmetic industry. So yet again, another way in which plants are impacting us. Tumor therapy, anti-aging. And then this is just looking at the idea of the use of what you just did last week in lab, the cell culture idea, plant cell culture. So one of the reasons I want to expose you to that idea is that it's becoming a really big thing. It's a skill set that if you can document that you've done that, that'll look good. So there's a lot of use of plant cell cultures, growing the plants carefully and without contamination. Here they're looking at it for cosmetics and food. And so this published in 2018. Some of you may know Ben Brickle from the MedPlant program. So he did some extra plant tissue culture work with me over the summer because he had an interview with a company downstate, a cannabis company that is getting into doing cloning using plant cell culture, tissue culture methods. And so I worked with them over the summer to kind of get them brushed up on that. We talked a lot about the theory behind it, and I sent an email just a little while ago. How'd it go? Did you get the job? He said, yep, got the job. They were really impressed with what I could say about the plant cell culture. And so I think, him having that knowledge was instrumental for him to land that job. And he really wanted that job. He was really excited about it. So I was really happy for him. So keep that in mind. Plant cell tissue culture techniques are really becoming a thing. So I'll post this this isn't going to be anything I'm testing you on. I just thought if you're interested, you might want to check this out. Okay, so now we're shifting out of hormones and signal transduction. We're going to get into more directly now the secondary metabolite idea. And so we're looking at how plants are making the secondary metabolites, and then what do they do with them. So first, I'd like to cover a little bit more about the general groups of secondary metabolites, and then after that, we'll get into, well, how are they using them specifically? So obviously, we've been learning how plants have no ability to just get up and run away. They can't pull out a gun and fend off anyone attacking them. So they have to deal with being attacked on an everyday basis. Their ability to sense what's going on around them is really quite good, better than what we have in terms of our gene repertoire, the genes that we have. They are very sophisticated in that realm of being able to assess what's happening around them on a minute-by-minute basis. And oh my goodness, they are exposed to so many different pathogens that can come along and attack them. And so, and then you think about all the insects and mammals that are chewing away on them and very aggressively removing large parts of their body. So we're thinking about the idea that yes, they certainly have innate defenses that they're like born with, just like we have innate defenses we're born with. They do too. And I'm not going to talk about that in this particular topic, but just recognize that they do have certain innate defenses that they have up and running the minute they start germinating and growing. We're going to focus on secondary metabolites, which these tend to be made in response to attack of some sort. So they're not always being made necessarily. Some are, but most of them aren't getting expressed. Those genes are quiet until the plant senses the need for that particular secondary metabolite. So they're induced responses. Okay, they're induced for the most part. There's some notable exceptions, but for the most part, these secondary metabolites really only get made when the plant is experiencing attack. And now we recognize through careful research, it's been documented that plants can tell who's attacking them. Not just this blanket response that they have to all pathogens. They have very targeted responses. So we'll get into that as well. So when we say the word or phrase secondary metabolites, what we mean by that is there's no direct role that they have in the primary metabolic reaction pathway, with a couple of exceptions. But in general, we can say that they're not involved in the everyday life of the plant, like carrying out photosynthesis and doing respiration. So all of that basic life processes, that secondary metabolites really don't play too much of a role in that. We also find that secondary metabolites tend to be restricted in key areas of the plant body. It's not necessarily a systemic thing found everywhere. And when you look at their capabilities, they do protect against a variety of different pathogens. And I'm saying pathogen in a very broad sense. That can also mean like herbivores. Okay, so competition with other plants. We know that secondary metabolites can also do plant-plant interactions. So you might have heard the term allelopathy. That is a term that's given where plants are excreting either a chemical through their roots. It could be a volatile as well that is retarding the growth of other plants nearby. Probably around in this area, the one, well, there's a black locust trees are awesome in that regard. If you've ever seen where black locusts are hanging out, they don't have many other plants around them. Their understory is pretty bare. And then allelopathy in terms of invasive weeds. A lot of invasive plants have allelopathic tendencies, like spotted knapweed. We have a whole monoculture of them down by the hoop house, down by the Jacobetti complex, that have been a big problem for me in terms of getting plants that we want into our field plots, and the spotted knapweed are very aggressive. Secondary metabolites are also being heavily studied for their role in pollination, so being used to attract a pollinator to the female plant, or the plant that has the egg in it. It could be a perfect plant or a flower, I guess. Seed dispersal too. Secondary metabolites do attract. So when the fruit is finally made, you got to get that fruit dispersed off of the mother plant, and they know that secondary metabolites can be very involved in that too. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that last bullet point. We're going to look more at how do they defend themselves against pathogens of a variety of different flavor. Okay, so this is kind of a big picture idea of the secondary metabolism. And you see on the top the primary metabolic pathways. So that's being shown in the kind of the pinkish tan box. And then the blue-green box down below, you start getting into the secondary metabolites. Those of you in chemistry or in the med plant program, this should be probably routine review for you. We're not going to get into the details of the nitty-gritty of the physiological pathways. I'm going to be concentrating more on just what are the three different groups, what are their general chemical makeup, and then how are they being used by the plant. So we're going to look at the ones in the kind of the gold boxes. We're going to look at the terpene groups of the phenolic compounds and the nitrogen-containing secondary products. So those are the three big groups of secondary metabolites. So let's break it down. Let's get into the phenolics. There's many, many, many phenolics being produced. If you think about the vastness of plant species out there, I'm sure we're going to discover many more as time goes by. So phenolics, you have the phenol, basic phenol chemical structure as part of that. And so you can see lignin falls into that category. So lignin is a structural component of the cell wall, remember. So, but it can also be considered a secondary metabolite in that respect as well. So I put these pathways here just to show you some of the pathways for phenolic production, but I'm not going to get into it other than to say that usually they have a phenylalanine intermediate in these pathways. So that's about it. We're not going to get into the actual physiological pathway. Okay. Here are some examples. We've already talked about caffeic acid, ferulic acid, another one, umbellapyrophorone, psoralen. So we'll talk about coumarins in general as we work through this. Phenylpropanoids, coumarin, benzoic acid derivatives. So we'll talk about salicylic acid as well. So these are just trying to get you to look at, the phenolic chemical makeup of these compounds. Let's take some examples. So here you may have heard somebody that you know that's taking coumarin. They might say, oh, I'm on coumarin. And that does limit, for example, some of the other foods or things that they can take if they're on this drug. It's actually an anticoagulant, so they have to be careful. They can't take coumarin along with any other blood thinners. That's too much. Sometimes you'll hear the drug name warfarin. Same idea. And so the structure is on the right here. It's a phenolic. Also, if you've worked on a farm or have driven by a farm and you smell that newly mown hay in a hay field, it's actually the grass is giving off coumarin. So it's in response to injury. It probably think it's getting attacked by something that's chewing on it. You know, the blades chewed up the hay, so it's releasing coumarin. I heard one we'll watch a documentary where one of the plant biologists says that the smell of newly mown hay or grass in your yard. He says something to the effect of, yeah, it's the grass's version of screaming. I'm like, oh, that's kind of a downer. But that's, I guess, one way to put it. They're giving off that warning chemical, I'm being eaten, and it's a volatile. It's usually sending out that signal to nearby plants saying, hey, I'm getting eaten as you mow your lawn. So yet another reason not to mow your lawn. So, and then there's certain allelopathic compounds that can be released as well, often into the soil to try to inhibit other species seed germination and root growth. They're competing for resources in the soil, so roots will compete with nearby roots. Yeah, exactly. So they're immune to their own allelopathic chemicals, but they're betting on someone nearby is going to be sensitive to it. Oh. I'm blanking at the moment. Spotted knapweed has a certain allelopathic chemical that I'm blanking on, but we had to test for it because the soil plot that we worked with for Grant, one of my grad student Grant, he did his field plot study, and there was so much knapweed that we had to get out of there. And I was worried that the chemical that it produces might be lingering in the soil. So that was part of his research, was to test the soil samples for that secondary metabolite. And at least the initial look at the data, that field plot didn't really have huge amounts of that allelopathic chemical. So that's good. And he was able to get his plants to grow in that field plot. So it must have degraded well enough. Well, that soil is so sandy, it probably just leached through and didn't really stay long enough to affect Grant's plants that went into that soil. But so I'm glad we didn't have to worry too much about it. So flavonoids are phenolics, and so we've talked about flavonoids already, the anthocyanins, for example, but there's other type of pigments, flavones, flavanols, isoflavones. Polyphenolic compounds right now are big in the health industry right now. There's a lot of push for research into polyphenolics, saying that they're good for our health. And so you'll probably see quite a bit of that in the just everyday public, health news, health articles. They're talking a lot about polyphenolic compounds. Isoflavonoids are antimicrobial, so the plant can make these. There's a group of isoflavonoids that are called phytoalexins that are super potent. Their claim to fame is that when the plant is getting attacked by a certain bacteria, the plant will make really large numbers of phytoalexins at really high levels, and they're very potent. So when they first discovered them, they were surprised to see how potent they could be against certain key pathogens. They also know that some of the isoflavonoids that are released by plants are insecticidal. So they make their own version of insecticide as well. Rotenone is derived from that. And in the human health, they are showing that some studies have shown intake of soybean products can because it's so high in isoflavonoids, they say can be perhaps an anti-cancer link in human health as well. So some interesting studies going on there. So in general, when you look at plant secondary metabolites, so many of those secondary metabolites are considered good for our health and is part of a healthy diet. And so that's why one of the main reasons why so many people are looking at plant secondary metabolites is because we can apply it to human health and trying to improve our health. So there's a lot of studies being done. Here, this is anti-estrogenic in the sense that plants can produce certain isoflavonoids as they're getting chewed on by mammals like sheep. And they've actually shown that the female sheep become infertile. And they think the isoflavonoid is acting as an anti-estrogen, like a mimic to estrogen. So the estrogen is kind of getting outcompeted for the receptor site by the mimic isoflavonoid. So there's some interesting, of course, if you're a sheep grazer or raiser and you want to have, baby sheep, this is not a good idea to have them chewing on plants high in isoflavonoids. So other groups of flavonoids, the flavones and flavonols, some are very capable of absorbing light at wavelengths that we just can't pick up with our rods and cones in our retina. And so they're used for that. But so in that regard, they're important for pollination ideas in the sense that the bees are attracted to the flowers in a different way than what our eyes can perceive. And it works really well for getting the attention of the bees so that the flower can get pollinated. Flavones and flavonols can be found in leaf tissue, and that's more not for pollination ideas or attracting a pollinator. It's more to protect against too much sunlight coming in too quickly, and especially the ultraviolet. They're able to absorb that ultraviolet and release it as heat. And then they know too that legume plants that are trying to get nitrogen fixing bacteria, they can release flavones that act as a chemical. So in this case, it's a secondary metabolite being used to attract a key partner that they want to partner up with if you want nitrogen fixers in your roots. Legume plants are famous for being able to do that. Just some interesting visuals I thought I'd throw in. So here is what we see when we look at a black-eyed Susan flower. But when a bee looks at it, they would see something more like this. And so you can see how it's kind of created a target zone, that dark in the middle, followed by the white on the periphery. That creates kind of a target, like, come to the center of that zone. So look how different that is. So we can't pick up on that. We don't see it that way at all. But for bees, that's a target for them. And so they're attracted to that, and they'll know right where to hone in order to get the nectar or the pollen. And as they do that, of course, they're pollinating the plant. Tannins. So tannins are definitely polymers. They're complex polymers. And tannins are, in general, they're toxic in high levels to many insects. Kind of interesting that something that can be toxic to insects can actually be good for us. But they show that if chewing insects or herbivores in general get too much of that too quickly in their gut, it actually retards their growth, and their ability to, their lifespan can be shortened. And so woody plants and trees are famous for lots of tannins in their wood, in the stem tissue. Unripe fruit, when you taste that astringent kind of mouth puckering unripe fruit thing going on, when you taste an unripe fruit, those are tannins. They're very astringent, they say, when you have them on your tongue and in your mouth. So animals have learned to avoid that. It's like, ooh, that's unpleasant, and it's supposed to be unpleasant. It's supposed to get you to walk away from it because fruit needs to go through a process before it should be eaten and dispersed. And if you eat that fruit before the seeds are ready, that's not good for the mother plant. So what tannins tend to do when you, like an insect is starting to chew on the plant, it'll bind to proteins in the insect's gut primarily, and it will mess with their ability to digest their food. So obviously, if that is messed up, then they can't digest well enough, they can't get energy from that food, and if it's bad enough, they'll die. At the very least, they'll get sick and crawl away and stop chewing. And so it can be a range of detrimental effects on the insect depending on species and how much they've eaten. Many animals have high proline concentrations in their saliva that can inactivate essentially the tannins. So that's another concept we need to consider is that, you know, plants are busy making these secondary metabolites, but you have to factor the other perspective. The pathogen or herbivore or mammal attacking them is also co-evolving to that secondary metabolite. And so you have these interactions where the organism attacking the plant is mutating and evolving to try to deal with that secondary metabolite and get around it somehow. So we'll talk about that as we work through the information on plant defenses. So it's definitely a dance between the plant and the pathogen. So if you've ever seen trees that have been cut down and you see that large area often of darkening wood tissue, that's a lot of tannin that has been impregnated into those areas and is very antimicrobial, antifungal, antibacterial. But on the other hand, they can be important in our health. So it's kind of odd to think of it that way, but you can find high levels in apples and teas and pomegranates. Red wine has polyphenols, which are in tannins. So resveratrol too. That's why I put the red wine glass here. They're saying that is a good secondary metabolite that we should be taking into our bodies. But they did the calculation with red wine, and the amount of red wine you'd have to drink per day to get your daily dose of resveratrol is like, I don't know, close to 2 liters. And so they're like, no, I better not do that. Darn it. So, you know, so resveratrol, and there's other things. There's tannins in red wine. It's you know, other types. So what the studies are showing in human health is that it blocks endothelial-1 signal molecule that is causing constriction of your blood vessels. So in general, humans don't want their blood vessels constricted, right? And so if you can find a way to prevent that, they're saying that's a good thing. So red wine in moderation is actually, many doctors would advocate that if you don't have an addiction, that it's okay. But what they mean is the current definition of that is 1 glass a day for females and 2 glasses for men. So just keep that in mind. But you can also get it from grapes, red grapes. So you don't have to drink alcohol in order to get that benefit. And especially if you keep the skin on, don't peel the grape. Especially the red grapes are really high, and the seeds, but there's so many seedless. I can't even find grapes with seeds anymore. Can you? I don't really like them, but for Plant Kingdom, I like to show grapes with seeds, and I can't even buy them. So it's a little frustrating. That's pomegranate, if you didn't know, on the lower left there. And then the oak barrels that they'll age wine or hard liquor in, often the oak barrels themselves will, as the liquor or the red wine is aging in that will pull in some tannins from the oak barrels too. So I always am curious to see how the different, if I buy red wine, I always look to see what they're aged in, what kind of barrels. So I guess there's a wine out there that is aged in like stainless steel instead of wood, and I won't even consider trying it just because I'd rather have the secondary metabolites from the oak barrels. So I don't know if anyone's tried those. A lot of you aren't over 21, so technically you shouldn't have tried them. But anyways, I just don't see the attraction of that myself. But okay, terpenes. Let's shift into terpenes a little bit, get a little bit broad perspective on this. Terpenes, you're looking at an isoprene repeating unit, which is being shown here off to the right. Definitely, so far anyways, the largest class of secondary metabolites that plants makes. The variety is massive, so obviously I'm just going to give you a few examples. And so they're isoprene units strung together. Sometimes they're called isoprenoids. There are some that can be considered primary metabolites. So for example, carotenoids, which are present in pretty much any photosynthetic organism, are technically a terpene. Gibberellins, chlorophyll, phytol tail. So those are all involved in primary metabolism. So this is a noted exception, very important. But pyrethroids, really hard to say. Those are coming from chrysanthemum. And I knew the postdoc that was doing the breakthrough research on this. And they discovered it was in the chrysanthemum plant that it has really high insecticidal activity. And it was a new insecticide that they could use that's relatively safe to use around humans and other animals. And so they turned that into a commercial insecticide because it's relatively safe. And then they say it has a low persistence, which just means that there won't be a legacy of it in the soil, for example. It breaks down at a fairly quick rate so that it won't be possibly negatively impacting what's going on in the soil. So that is kind of a famous example of a terpene. A lot of essential oils are terpenes. So here you're looking at a blow up of a trichome, a glandular trichome. Those are the types that tend to have a fair dose of essential oils in them. If you've grown herbs, obviously, I think you are very well versed in the idea that just brushing the leaf, you can get a really pungent smell. We were just working with essential oils in my lab last hour, and I stepped out of the lab to go get something, and I walked back in, and we were working with cinnamon, clove, rosemary. What was the other one? Eucalyptus. And so the whole lab smelled wonderful. Lots of essential oils. Big business right now. Essential oils in the commercial realm is big business, and it's getting bigger. I don't see this going away anytime soon. And compared to just a couple decades ago, essential oils, no one seemed very interested in it. And now it seems like people are coming back to it, that this can be a very useful part of our lives in terms of our human health and preventative medicine. Beautiful picture of trichomes. So monoterpenes, sesquiterpenes, those glandular trichomes can be found, so when you look at the hairs, the trichomes on the leaf, also in the fruit. Limonene, boy, I see limonene in so many different products. Menthol, of course, very pungent. So, of course, the plants aren't making that for us to smell it and go, "Ooh, that smells good." I mean, we're taking advantage of it, but from the plant's perspective, they're doing it to protect themselves primarily. So certainly a lot of terpenes are volatile and very easy to pick up on with our nose, but there's non-volatiles. So limonoid, again, give that bitter taste or that very acidic taste in the citrus fruit. Azadirachtin is a potent insecticide found. It was kind of serendipitous discovery in the neem tree. So neem oil, you may see that as a product from in the garden center at different shops where they'll sell neem oil. And so it's, as a duractant, is the active compound, and it can work at very low concentrations. So we use neem oil a lot in the greenhouse to help the plant fend off different chewing insects primarily. I feel good about using it in the sense that it's not dangerous to the person who's applying it to the plant, so don't have to worry. And so it was discovered in India, but it's been a worldwide phenomenon now, and you can find it, just go into Walmart in the garden center, it'll be there. These tests have shown that there's no harm. It's in general, although I did read a paper a year or so ago where they said, we better test it a little bit more carefully with the soil microbes. So there's many beneficial soil microbes that hang out with plants, and they're worried that overuse of neem could get into the soil and harm the microbial community there. So the story's still out with the microbes, but at least the studies that they've done with animals and insects, the ladybugs in primary. So ladybugs are actually a good biocontrol agent, by the way. We use those in the greenhouse too. Anytime I see have you ever noticed that? Especially in the stairwells, for some reason, there's ladybugs that are crawling on the wall. If I see one, I'll actually capture it and bring it to the greenhouse. It's like, can't help myself. It's like, go eat some nasty things in the greenhouse. So I once released thousands of ladybugs into the greenhouse right around this time of year. They're dealing with an aphid infestation. So I ordered ladybugs, and they come in these mesh bags, and like 3,000 to a bag. And I bought 4 bags, so I could release 6,000 into 2. We have the teaching greenhouse, the research greenhouse. This was a few years ago. I didn't know they'd be so active, so I unpacked them from the packaging, and they were crawling around, and they're like crazy. And it was toward the end of the afternoon, so I got my younger son. I said, "You want to go release some ladybugs?" And he's like, "Yeah, sure." So we go into the greenhouse and just carefully open the bags and started releasing them. And I thought they'd just fly, like, be free, fly. They started crawling all over us. So I had them crawling up my legs, up my pant legs, and up under my, I had a long sleeve shirt, and they were crawling all over me. I'm like, oh, great. So luckily I don't mind ladybugs. I wasn't freaked out, but my son's a little bit like, what's going on here? Managed to get them all off, but yeah, that company is like, you aren't kidding when you said you deliver active ladybugs. But I just didn't think they'd be wanting to hang out with me. I thought they'd immediately go to the trees and plants. But anyways, they can be very effective. As a duractant, so these are neem branches. And you may see neem in like skincare products, shampoo. People will shampoo with neem-based shampoo. So you may see that. Cardinalides, wow. Glycosides are an example. Very bitter, toxic. And so they're affecting your heart muscle, which obviously got to be careful. So it's kind of weird. If you take it in low doses, it can be beneficial to your heart. If you take it in higher doses, it can kill you. And so that famous quote, dose makes the poison, is so true in so many of these cases with secondary metabolites. And so I know people that are taking well, I don't have it up here. Let me show you. So this is the foxglove plant, and the genus name is digitalis. And so that's the name of the chemical that you take if you need to regulate your heart. And so I had a friend, an older friend that was on that when she was in her like 70s, I guess. They put her on that because her heart rate would get too irregular and sped up. And so they put her on low doses of that. So it can be very beneficial at low doses. but at high doses, it can mess with you. So those are pretty potent plant secondary metabolites, and it's in foxglove, which is commonly used in landscaping. And so it's a plant you can find all over Marquette in the summertime. Okay, so those are just a handful of examples to get you thinking. Huge class of compounds. I also wanted to talk about the nitrogen-containing compounds. These are something that can directly impact us because we're mammals. And so now we're thinking about the alkaloids, cyanogenic glycosides, glucosinolates, glutamin, and non-protein amino acids are all examples. So they're nitrogen-containing compounds. And their pathway, when you look at how are they made, they're coming from amino acid. And if you think about the alkaloids themselves, just them alone, they're just that group. There's over 15,000 compounds and counting. And those primarily target mammals that are attacking the plant. And so very potent. They have since discovered that endophytic fungi living inside plants can produce alkaloids as well that defend the plant, help defend the plant against certain mammals. And so the presence of those endophytic fungi as the mammal is chewing on the plant is actually a good thing. Those fungi will pump out their own alkaloids. So that was discovered in tall fescue when they were looking at some native grasses in the plain states. They were able to discover that. And since then, they've noted lots of different endophytic fungi and bacteria can do this. So, of course, alkaloids are very famous. Cocaine, nicotine, morphine, caffeine, all really good examples of alkaloids, very distinct impacts on the mammal. And again, it's anywhere from relatively benign to super potent and addicting. So it can be amazing how potent those can be. Here's an idea of how the herbivore is kind of co-evolving with the plant. And so the plant is pumping out these alkaloids. What can happen is that it can get reduced. So as they get it into their digestive system, they can reduce it or oxidize it, oxidize it. So it's just the opposite. So if it gets reduced, it's toxic. But then if the herbivore's physiology can oxidize it, then it becomes non-harmful. So again, that's coming through the process of both these organisms co-evolving with each other over generations to see this adaptation going on. So pyrrolizidine alkaloids are being shown here. You don't need to know that. It's just alkaloids in general. Some versions of alkaloids can be detoxified by the herbivore. So cyanogenic glycosides, so cyanin, think about cyanin. So that's what you're seeing here. Hydrogen cyanide being the product at the end here. You start with the cyanogenic glycoside, and you can see through a stepwise reaction pathway, you end up with hydrogen cyanide. So what tends to happen is if the plant tissue is intact, it's fine. But if the plant tissue gets damaged, like being chewed on by a mammal, let's say, then this pathway kicks into gear and you get hydrogen cyanide. So it's not like the plant has a bunch of hydrogen cyanide in its tissues ready to go. That's not the case. It's the cyanogenic glycosides that they have. And then as soon as the chewing action, primarily by the mammal, it can convert. Yeah. Yeah, they can separate where they have these different compounds in their tissues. So some can be in the vacuole, some can be in certain parts of the cytoplasm, or sometimes they even sequester in the cell wall space. And so you have that spatial separation. So the plant's not in any risk of cyanide poisoning, but when the organism chewing on it, well, then you got problems. So one of the classic examples for human health is cassava or cassava, depending on who's saying it. I always said cassava. How do you guys say it? Cassava? I don't know. I don't know which is. I think Martha Stewart says cassava. So maybe that is the right way. I don't know. But I laughed the first time I heard her say it because I've never said it that way. But anyways, huge staple. It's a food crop in tropical, subtropical. It's like a main food crop. And I just kind of shake my head like, how did they figure out? Because you have to cook it a very particular way or you get poisoned and die. And so they have to take the raw cassava and then they have to cook it really well to get all the nasty enzymes and chemicals out of there. So one of my grad students went down to Brazil. We had a class that went down there a few years ago. This was way before COVID. And they were showing a cassava plantation and how they process it. And my grad students took a tiny piece of raw cassava and ate it. And oh, did they get on him for that? They yelled at him, "What are you doing?" Because he didn't really fully appreciate that you can't eat raw cassava. So he was okay. He didn't get sick or anything. It was a small enough piece, but they were quite upset with him. Glucosinolates. So you experience these when you eat cabbage or broccoli or radish, that very pungent taste and smell. And so, whoops. Again, this is a case where the chemicals and enzymes in the plant are in different compartments of the plant cell and tissues. And then once you start eating them, you can get the full effect of both the volatile and the taste. Okay, so glucosinolates. And, these are considered very healthy for us, the glucosinolates. It's kind of weird. Okay, we'll stop there and we'll wrap this up on Wednesday and then start getting into how plants are using these molecules to defend themselves in more detail.